Welcome to the History of European Theatre podcast, and thanks for joining me on this journey through millennia of theatrical history. Episode 120, William of Stratford, Part 3, Would I Were in an Alehouse in London. Last time, I left William and Anne Shakespeare with their eldest daughter in their arms at her baptism, a happy moment following on a few months after the necessities of their wedding. That episode, combined with what Professor Scheil added in her guest episode, covers just about all that we know of the family's early life. To this, though, I should add the significant event of the birth of twins, Hamnet and Judith, who were baptised in February 1585. But moving the family story beyond this is difficult, because from 1585 until 1592, there is no documented activities in Shakespeare's life, except for a 1588 document concerning a dispute over mortgaged land that his father was fighting. And even in this, William is just mentioned as John's son, with no other indication of his profession or location. However, that absence of information has given space for myth and legend to grow up about the young Shakespeare family. There are a couple of these legends that have become so well known that it would be remiss of me not to mention them here. The first of these tells how Shakespeare went to a nearby village of Bidford and spent the evening with friends in the tavern there. Having partaken of a little too much Worcester ale, the young man found himself incapable of finding his way home and spent the night sleeping it off in the open, with only a crab tree for protection. This story surfaced in 1762, when an Oxford librarian, Francis Radcliffe, made a trip to Stratford to investigate Shakespeare's personal history. The story was then built up further a few years later, when it was enhanced to the effect that the following morning William's companions discovered him and suggested continuing the drinking session. William wisely declined. The legend was a popular one, and for years tourists picked at the tree until it began to decline, and was moved into the garden of the local vicarage for protection. This unfortunately failed to deter the souvenir seekers, and eventually the poor remains of the tree were dug up by the vicar, who was fed up of tourists trampling his garden, so that no trace of it remains now. It has to be said that any semblance of truth in this story is highly dubious. The other most famous legend of the young Shakespeare is that of him as a poacher and deer slayer. The story seems to come from a strong local tradition, but didn't surface in print until 1709, when a new edition of the complete plays was published. Prior to this, there had been 3 reprints of the first folio, which had become somewhat corrupted. An editor, Nicholas Rowe, himself a playwright and literary scholar of the then current rationalist mode, made many revisions and amendments, and he is therefore considered the first editor of Shakespeare. His 6-volume edition of Shakespeare plays reflects his experience of acting and writing plays. Following that rationalist neoclassical vogue of the time, he applied organisation and order to the plays. He divided them into 5 acts and scenes, and marked entrances and exits of characters consistently for the first time. He also established the list of characters for each play and normalised the spelling of the names. Prior to this, printed editions used varying spellings for names, sometimes even within the same edition. It was also the first illustrated edition, with 1 engraving for each play. These engravings, by François Boutard, reflect the performance and presentation styles of the early 18th century. The edition also included plays now removed from the canon, as Rowe followed the 4th folio. Sir John Oldcastle, a play now attributed to Anthony Munday, Michael Drayton and several other collaborators, and The Lamentable Tragedy of Lucrece, whose authorship is still contested but most likely by Robert Greene and or George Peele, both feature as the work of Shakespeare in this edition. If you'd like to hear more about Nicholas Rowe, who, for the avoidance of doubt, I don't believe I have any relationship to besides the shared surname, and other 17th and 18th century commentators on Shakespeare, you can find all that you need to know over on Patreon for a small monthly fee, and you would be helping support my work here, so please do give it some thought. As part of his introduction, Rowe added a short biography of Shakespeare, and to create this account, he sent researchers off to Stratford and other places associated with Shakespeare to see what he could find. The result, perhaps not surprisingly, is a story told through anecdotes and second or third hand remembrances. This, from his introduction to the complete plays, is how he tells the story of the recently married William. In this kind of settlement he continued for some time until an extravagance that he was guilty of forced him both out of his country and that way of living which he had taken up. He had, by misfortune common enough to young fellows, fallen into ill company, and amongst them some that made the frequent practice of deer stealing engaged him with them more than once in robbing a park that belonged to Sir Thomas Lucy of Chilcot near Stratford. For this he was prosecuted by the gentleman, as he thought somewhat too severely, and in order to revenge that ill usage he made a ballad upon him. And although this, probably the first essay of poetry, be lost, yet it is said to have been so very bitter that it redoubled the prosecution against him, to the degree that he was obliged to leave his business and family in Warwickshire for some time and shelter himself in London. So, Rowe makes this event the catalyst that made Shakespeare leave Stratford for London, in the face of some further punishment, and this then provides the link between William, family man of Stratford, and Shakespeare, the man of the theatre who ends up in London. This may be neat, but we don't know if it's a truly causal link, and indeed, this story may be no nearer the truth than any others. As a story, it persisted through embellishment in the retelling and the idea that The Merry Wives of Windsor contains some disparaging punning on the Lucy family name. Shakespeare, it is suggested, still held a grudge over the incident, and maybe he did. What we can say with more certainty is that Shakespeare, the glover's apprentice or schoolmaster or whatever he was, left Stratford and was in London by 1592. One possibility is that he joined an acting troupe as it passed through Stratford and started his theatrical career in that way. I have mentioned before that players are recorded in Stratford on several occasions through his childhood, and the mystery plays were still being performed at Easter in the nearby town of Coventry until he was in his mid-teens. There's also the possibility that amateurs were involved in some performances, and who's to say that William did not join in with that and got the acting bug. It was in 1587 that the Queen's men visited Stratford while on tour of the country. You'll remember that the Queen's men were the pick of the actors of the day, specially selected by the Queen to both ensure that her sponsored troupe was the best in the country and taking the opportunity to take her former favourite, the Earl of Leicester, down a peg or two. The Queen's men were partly made up of actors from his troupe. One of the members was Richard Tarleton, the Queen's favourite comic performer, and making what would be his last performances. He died the following year. The crowds that gathered to see him didn't know this, of course, but their enthusiasm for him was hardly contained. In Abingdon, in Oxfordshire, windows in the Guildhall were broken in the people's efforts to see him. The troupe moved on and arrived at Thame, relatively nearby, for another performance. Late at night, two actors, William Knell and John Towne, got into a fight. Swords were drawn, and as the pair fought, Towne stabbed Knell through the neck. He died within 30 minutes, and Towne was hauled off to jail. His plea of self-defence was accepted, and in time the legal niceties were completed. He was granted formal pardon from execution for murder by the Queen. One thing that came out of that night that we know for sure was that Knell's widow, Rebecca, remarried a year later to John Hemmings, fellow actor and, in time, associate and friend of Shakespeare and collaborator in the creation of the First Folio. This is just one of several actors turned violent on themselves stories, of which there are several in the period. But it has also been pointed out that this meant that the troupe could have arrived in Stratford a man down, and perhaps looking for an eager replacement. Perhaps this was the window of opportunity that gave William, then 23 years old, his way into the world of the professional player. It's speculative for sure, but the next time we can trace William, he's in London and involved with the theatre. Anecdotes concerning Shakespeare's arrival and early days in London are as dubious as those that purport to tell of his life in Stratford. One that has stuck, but only appeared in 1753, is that an impoverished William started to earn a little by caring for the horses of theatre-goers while they were seeing a show. It turned out that he was rather good at this and started to employ boys to assist him. He soon came to the notice of some of the players at the theatre, who spotted his interest and his erudite ways, and in time offered him work in the theatre. When Samuel Johnson retold this story in his 1765 edition of the Complete Plays, he expanded it to make it sound like Shakespeare was a natural entrepreneur and sympathetic gangmaster. Another suggestion is that he travelled to London as a representative of his father's gloving business to drum up some trade, or deal with suppliers, or perhaps even to expand into London markets. But once again, there is no direct evidence of this. The first real hint of Shakespeare's early time in London comes from Aubrey, where he reports that he lived in Shoreditch. This based on information he gained from William Beeston, the son of Christopher Beeston, who acted with Shakespeare in the 1590s. So there is good reason for us to believe that this has a germ of truth about it. It also makes some logical sense, as this was close to the theatre, then run by the Burbages, and being in Shoreditch would certainly have placed Shakespeare in the milieu of the theatrical world. It was by no means the best end of town, in fact little more than a slum of poor cottages and narrow alleyways, reaching out towards the marshes and the remains of monastic buildings that sat outside the city walls. Christopher Marlowe lived nearby, as did Richard Tarleton, and Shakespeare's erstwhile nemesis, Robert Greene. In 1596, Shakespeare had moved to the more salubrious Bishopsgate part of London, still not the smartest end of town, but in the north of the city and still close to the theatre world. He turns up there in the tax records that year. The lay subsidy rolls are the record of assessed tax of each person and the payments that were made parish by parish, not just in London but throughout the country. These were collected 3 times a year, with wealthier citizens being assessed on the value of their lands and goods, and the poorer citizens being charged a standard poll tax of 4 pence. That's a tax due per person where they didn't own lands or goods of any significant value. In October 1596, in Bishopsgate, Shakespeare was assessed on goods valued at £5, on which he was obliged to pay tax of 5 shillings. The fact that he appears on the roll means that he was a householder in the parish, that he was resident there, not necessarily that he owned the property. An assessment of £5 worth of goods is a pretty average sum, definitely in the realms of the working man doing okay, not particularly poor, but certainly not wealthy either. In February 1597, the payment of this assessment was due, but in Shakespeare's case, he didn't pay it. He is also listed as defaulting on the sum due on the 15th of November that year. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that he was dodging taxes, but that he was either dead or departed from the ward, or unable to make the payment due to a change in circumstances for the worse. It seems that the notes made on the rolls by the collectors were done in order to protect their own position rather than to explain in detail why they could not collect the taxes due. Shakespeare turns up on the rolls again in the St Helens ward on the 1st of October 1598 and is again assessed for tax on the basis of £5 worth of goods. So clearly he wasn't dead, and either he was trying to dodge his taxes or he'd just moved to another part of London. The collection system was somewhat chaotic, and comments like this about individuals are not unusual and don't necessarily imply any criminal intent. The same rolls from St Helens also mention the name of Thomas Morley, who is probably the musician who published a number of settings of songs that he'd written, including one of Shakespeare's from As You Like It. We also find that Shakespeare failed to pay his tax due on this occasion, but here the note mentions that he was now living under the jurisdiction of the Bishop of Winchester, having moved to the Liberty of the Clink in Southwark, which was an area kept to the bishop's benefit. So this is definitely not dodging, but a move to new premises, presumably to be nearer to the newly opening Globe Theatre. Records of this type continue to help us to trace Shakespeare's movements through London in later years, but that's for another time. The London of the late 16th century was a busy place. The population was climbing to about 200,000 persons, meaning that there had been a quadrupling of the population in the last 100 years or so, and it was a trend that would continue through to the 1600s, with the city population ending the century at double that number. Before the rebuilding brought on by the Great Fire of 1666, London was a particularly disordered collection of houses and plots of lands of odd shapes and sizes. The rapid expansion of the city meant that close farmland had mostly gone, to be replaced by housing of varying quality. In the city, space was at a premium, hemmed in by the city walls, and houses were taxed by the size of their footprint, both of which encouraged builders to go up rather than out, even when there was room to do so, and the primary building material of the time, wood, made this relatively easy to do. Houses were built up to 5 stories high, often with the upper stories overhanging the ground floor, keeping that footprint as small as possible, but maximising the living space. Typically, in the city, the ground floor was a shopfront with workrooms or living space behind, and upper floors used for storage and living space. Where servants and apprentices might live in the small rooms in the very upper floors under the eaves of the roof, the middle-level rooms could be let out to lodgers. It's notable that many of the playwrights we hear about, Greene, Kidd, Marlowe and Nash, for example, all had lodgings, not homes, in London. In his later life, Shakespeare was still a lodger, but we must assume in more comfortable circumstances than at his arrival in town. As a successful playwright and businessman, he could certainly afford to keep comfortable rooms in London to provide a base for his London life. But to return to the early days, we get positive information in London in 1592 from the infamous Upstart Crow quote from Robert Greene's A Groat's Worth of Grit. I covered the life and work of Robert Greene and the Upstart Crow comment in a Season 5 episode called A Sextet of Tudor Playwrights, so you can go back to that if you need to recap on Greene. But for completeness here, I'll touch on the Upstart Crow comment again. We tend to see this now as a rather pathetic jibe by a second-rate author who was only popular in his time and who failed to recognise genius when he saw it. Perhaps this is inevitable. It's on the par with the record executive who rejected the Beatles, thinking beat groups were a passing fad, and the publishers who turned down Harry Potter, seeing its boarding school setting as rather outdated. But in its fuller form, which is more rarely given, the quote from Greene is a bit more than that. For there is an upstart crow beautified with our feathers, that with his tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide, supposes that he is as well able to bombast out blank verse as the best of you, and being an absolute Johannes factotum, and is in his own conceit the only shake scene in the country. The tiger's heart is a reference to a Shakespeare line, O tiger's heart wrapped in a woman's hide, from Henry VI Part 3, which was probably the latest Shakespeare play at the time that Greene was writing. So Greene is showing us that he knows the work, and thinks an actor who writes plays cannot deserve the same or greater praise than those better, university-educated playwrights who made up the core of what he thought was most exciting about the London theatre scene. He creates the word shake scene for an actor, a term that was never picked up or used again as far as I can tell, and was probably using the Latin for jack of all trades, Johannes factotum, as a play on the name of John Florio, or Johannes Florio, as this influential humanist thinker was known to his contemporaries. If this is correct, then typically of Greene, this is a bit of a throwaway jibe that tries to show off his own learning and his skills at punning on scholarly matters, presumably aimed at his fellow university alumni, who may well have had a lot of sympathy with his view of Shakespeare and his talents. Greene was a bitter man, close to death and living in abject poverty, and he didn't only have the upstart Shakespeare in his sights. The same passage goes on to criticise in a typically Elizabethan coded way both Marlowe and Nash. With the publication of the pamphlet taking place a month after Greene died, the publisher felt it necessary to disassociate himself from the text, saying that the whole thing was at the risk of Henry Chettle. You can hear more about Chettle in the episodes on Thomas Dekker, and for his biography, go to the concluding episode of Season 5, that's episode 112. Chettle, in turn, published a denial of his involvement, claiming only that he had a role in organising Green's papers after his death, while at the same time apologising to Shakespeare and Nash for his part in any offence. His apology also suggests that some had leapt to Shakespeare's defence, with the feeling that this pamphlet caused quite a stir in the theatrical community and a good deal of ego-smoothing was required. But once again, there is much that this exchange does not tell us. But we can reasonably extrapolate that by 1592, Shakespeare was well known enough to have generated not only Green's notice, but his ire too. Shakespeare meant something to people in the theatrical world at least, as a playwright and possibly as an actor too. Green clearly expected his quote from Shakespeare's play to be recognised by at least some of the readers of his pamphlet. Already, by 1592, Shakespeare had made a mark in the London playhouse. And just in case we were thinking that Green's mention of the tiger's heart was not proof of this, there is another source we can turn to. Thomas Nash's Pierce Penniless was registered at the stationer's office in August 1592. In it, he clearly refers to the death of old Talbot in Act 4, when he says, "How would it have joyed brave Talbot, the terror of the French, to think that after he had lain 200 years in his tomb, he should triumph again on the stage, and have his bones new embalmed with the tears of 10,000 spectators at least, and at several times, who, in the tragedy that represents his person, imagined they behold him fresh bleeding." Which makes it sound like Henry VI was a very popular piece. Of course, the fact that it was extended into 3 plays also acts as confirmation that this was a crowd pleaser. The first 2 parts also have an early and strong publishing history in quarto editions. Quite a success for a young dramatist still in his 20s. I will, of course, be looking at the Henry VI plays in detail in future episodes. The dating of early plays is uncertain, but Titus Andronicus, Richard III, The Taming of the Shrew and The Comedy of Errors are usually placed in the early years by general consensus. The degree to which these early plays were co-authored has been much debated, and something else that I'll cover when discussing individual plays. But as a note for the general biography, there seems little doubt that Shakespeare was working in collaboration with others to some degree, and in doing so, he was doing nothing unusual. As I hope the previous episodes on the English Renaissance theatre have shown, collaboration was the norm for playwrights of the period. And although we don't have evidence of shared payments for Shakespeare in the way we do for others, there's no reason to believe that he would not have fitted into the usual way playwrights had of working at the time. For this early period of William's life in London, it's not been possible to associate him with one specific playing troupe. Given that an author's rights passed to the troupe who commissioned it or agreed to first perform it, we might have expected the plays to be performed by a single troupe, as they would be once Shakespeare had settled with the iterations of the King's Men. But this wasn't the case. Henry VI gets performed at the Rose by Lord Strang's men, but the quarto version of The Taming of the Shrew says that it was performed by Pembroke's men, suggesting that Shakespeare had an association with them. That idea is strengthened by the fact that the first folio is dedicated, among others, to Lord Pembroke, suggesting that he had a significant role in Shakespeare's career. To further complicate the picture, the right to perform plays sometimes passed from one troupe to another, as they merged and then split off again, which was something that particularly happened at about this time. And of course, our picture of exactly who performed what is far from complete. In fact, it's quite fragmentary. It's also been suggested that Shakespeare might have worked as a freelance playwright. This is certainly possible, but it would be unusual for the time, especially if we consider his youth and perhaps the need for experienced guiding hands to help him, not to mention the desire of theatre owners to be sure that this young playwright would come up with the goods. Having said that, the impression is that these early plays were crowd pleasers, and success would presumably have dispersed any concerns of that nature very quickly. The closure of theatres due to the prevalence of plague in the city by the order of the Privy Council in January 1593 drove the players to touring the country. London theatres were reopened briefly in the winter of 1594, but closed with another wave of infections and only finally reopened in spring that year. During this long hiatus, was Shakespeare travelling as an actor, or was he kicking his heels in London or Stratford? Some, those who feel his descriptions of exotic settings have to be born from lived experience, have suggested that he spent the time travelling through Europe, to Italy, the Mediterranean islands, and perhaps even North Africa. I probably don't need to add that there is no documentary evidence for such travels, but there isn't. More likely is that he spent his time in England and concentrated on writing poetry. His narrative poem, Venus and Adonis, is usually dated to this period, and it carries a dedication to a patron, the Earl of Southampton. The search for and maintenance of a patron was an important business for poets, and a dedication was often added to a volume as a matter of speculation. The Earl was a strong supporter of poets, but that was no guarantee that he might be flattered enough to open his purse to an aspiring young poet and playwright. Thomas Nash had dedicated a volume to the Earl in a similar way, but apparently got no response, as the dedication was removed from subsequent printings. Shakespeare's dedication in Venus and Adonis begins, "Right Honourable, I know not how I shall offend in dedicating my unpolished lines to your lordship, nor how the world will censure me for choosing so strong a prop to support so weak a burden. Only if your honour seemed but pleased, I account myself highly praised, and vow to take advantage of all idle hours till I have honoured you with some graver labour. But, if this first heir of my invention prove deformed, I shall be sorry it had so noble a godfather, and never ever after ere so burden a land, for fear it yield me still so bad a harvest. I leave it to your honourable survey, and your honour of your heart's content, which I wish may always answer to your own wish, and the world's hopeful expectation. Your honour in all duty, William Shakespeare." The tone is, for the times, respectful but not intimate. Although we don't know his response, it's hard to believe that Venus and Adonis didn't please the Earl. Its subject matter would appeal to the sensibilities of a young aristocrat, and the volume, quite unusually for the time, is almost perfectly printed. The feeling is that this was a labour of love for Shakespeare. Some scholars have suggested that the poem is a very early work, mostly composed in Stratford and then polished in London while a printer was sought. The lyrical scenes of country life in it suggest a poet immersed in the countryside. The volume was published by Richard Field, a fellow Stratfordian, who ran a printing shop in Blackfriars. It was registered in April 1593, William Shakespeare's first published work. Venus and Adonis was a great success and soon went into several reprints and, no doubt, buoyed by the success, the next year bought The Rape of Lucrece, called The Ravishment of Lucrece, in the Stationers' Register that May. Although this poem didn't have the commercial longevity of Venus and Adonis, it should still be viewed as successful. It too contained a dedication to the Earl of Southampton, this one rather more effusive than in the earlier volume, to the extent that most read into it evidence of a relationship that had become personal. "The love I dedicate to your lordship is without end, whereof this pamphlet, without beginning, is but a superfluous moiety. The warrant I have of your honourable disposition, not the worth of my untutored lines, makes it assured of acceptance. What I have done is yours, what I have to do is yours, being part in all I have, devoted yours. Were my worth greater, my duty would show greater. Meantime, as it is bound to your lordship, to whom I wish long life still lengthened with all happiness. Your lordship's in all duty, William Shakespeare." Again, we don't know Southampton's specific response or the monetary arrangement that they may have come to. One of those later myths did grow up to say that the Earl paid the poet £1,000, but this has no contemporary support. In October 1594, Baron Hudson requested of the Lord Mayor that his new troupe of players be allowed to perform at the Cross Keys Inn that winter. He had formed this group of players some time earlier that year, and they were recorded by Philip Henslowe as playing at the theatre in Newington Butts in June. Hudson was Lord Chamberlain to the Queen, a role that would also be taken by his son after his father's death in a couple of years, and his men played twice at court in December 1594 for the Christmas celebrations. The court accounts list William Shakespeare, William Kemp and Richard Burbage as servants of the Lord Chamberlain, and joint parties for the plays performed on St. Stephen's Day on the 26th of December and Innocents' Day on the 28th of December at the Royal Palace at Greenwich. So here, at last, we have Shakespeare without a doubt connected to an acting company. The fact that he is listed as a joint payee also suggests that he was a leading member of the company. The Lord Chamberlain's men would, of course, in time become the King's men, and Shakespeare would stay with them as their leading playwright until the end of his time in London and his return to Stratford. Whenever and however it was that Shakespeare arrived in London, his rise to be a leading member of the Lord Chamberlain's company and a successful playwright and published poet seems little short of meteoric. We can only assume that his talent was spotted quickly and allowed to flourish by those around him just when the public theatre in London was moving from its early days and into a more established phase. It seems to me to be a classic case of the right man being in the right place at the right time. How much he fed off the situation and how much the situation grew for the better because he was there is something we can't answer. But for sure, and whatever the case, Shakespeare and the Lord Chamberlain's men were about to go from strength to strength. Next time, Professor Catherine Chile makes a welcome return as we talk about the afterlife of Anne Hathaway, as a complement to our discussion last time about her life and times. Then it will be on with the biography of Shakespeare's later life as he reaches the pinnacle of success. In the meantime, please join the Facebook page or group, or find a podcast on Instagram or X just to keep up to date with new episodes and other theatre-related things. If you do feel able to help out with the costs of running the podcast, then please head on over to Patreon, where you will find additional content for a small monthly fee or a one-off donation. New episodes there are continuing the story of criticism of Shakespeare in the 18th century, but you also get immediate access to all of the back episodes too. And you can find details of ways to support the podcast at the website, which is www.thehistoryofeuropeantheatre.com. I look forward to your company next time, but if you do have any comments or concerns in the meantime, you can contact me by email at thoetp@gmail.com or via X at thoetp.